I do. I do like a good monster movie, so you know I can see where you're coming from.
Now I've learned there's slow zombies, fast zombies, and healing zombies. That's the latest thing I listened to. Did some zombies begin to heal up, and one of them got pregnant. But unfortunately, they killed that zombie before they found out what was coming out, whether it was going to be human or a zombified baby. But, you know, tell you the truth, when you start messing with DNA, who can tell what the outcome is going to be weeks or years later?
Yeah, that sounds a little bit like what's in the Book of Enoch.
Sure.
You know, around with all that stuff.
I never thought of that.
I just told somebody that yesterday about this V thing going on.
V?
Well, you can't say the word.
Oh.
Oh.
You mean
the smagination? What was that? What was that word, Liz Goodwin? The smagination. Oh no. You know what she's saying.
It's surprising. So many of them now are forcing municipal employees and people who are in the education process, government workers to get vaccinated.
It's against the Nuremberg.
The Nuremberg Treaty?
Yes.
It's supposed to be anyway, but they every time there's an objection raised that's legitimate, it's amazing how quickly the press comes out trying to debunk it. You know, you know, it's like they've got people working 24/7.
Oh, night and day.
You know.
Did you know that Liz Goodwin's one about the last vaccination was censored on 2 different platforms? They sent me a note. They say, you've got 1 strike against you, 2 more and you're out of here. I felt kind of proud.
You know, I had a pretty intense conversation with my doctor recently. And by the end of that conversation, his hands were shaking. He was so upset. But I think he was trying to convert me something fierce, you know, take the shot. And we went back and forth and we covered all kinds. I was surprised he'd engage with me as long as he did.
How many did we talk about have died? I read 7,000. Somebody else said like 44,000 have died since they're taking the vaccine.
They're covering up the numbers like crazy. They have to be. They've got to be huge numbers.
Yeah, the latest one from Renz, who's a lawyer who's been taking this whole thing on. And this was probably 2 weeks ago. He said 45,000, and that was basically from one source. You know, the lion's share of the accidents that are reported to VAERS. And there's about a dozen different groups that can be reported to. And they say only about 1% of the actual accidents get reported. And so if you got 45,000 reported to one agency, the VAERS, which again, it's the larger one, you know, so you're looking at over 200,000. Now that was, and I should mention that the 45,000 was based on the deaths after 3 days within 3 days of the second shot. So if you account for 30 days after the second shot, you're looking at an incredible number. And so the MSM is doing an incredible very good job of keeping the mainstream media keeping a very good job on keeping us stupid, keeping us uninformed. You know, so basically it comes down to, and it doesn't take very much to get into the VAERS network. Again, that's the bigger one. It's VAERS, Vaccine Accident something or other reporting system. And you can view that for yourself. And Google has not censored that because of the fact that it's a reporting system. But
all right, well, what do you say there, Dr. Loqchi? Are you ready to get started?
Sure.
All right, we got Steve here. It's going to be a moderator tonight. Steve McGuire, and here we have Mark Heston, of course, on the master of everything. A guy that knows probably more about eating butter than anybody else in the world.
Yeah.
Since you said start eating creamery butter, I start eating it.
All right.
It's improved.
Yeah, good. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so saturated fat is really the thing we should be eating. That's essentially what the Hebrews were eating. You know, we kind of get the wrong connotation when we read, what is it, Leviticus, I forgot the chapter, 17, I can't remember, where it talks about, you know, when you bring
fat
your
blood.
When you bring your offering into the temple, do not partake of the fat of the blood. You know, that was given to Noah when he stepped off the ark, don't partake of any blood. But in verse 3 of chapter 9, he's basically told, and this is a purposeful mistranslation, I think I've shared this with you guys before, is that, and when, you know, we as Adventist vegetarians had struggled with this thing, but when you go back to the Hebrew, it starts making sense. Well, I'm sure most of us are familiar with what it says, and in King James, most all the other translations, Genesis 9:3, where it says, every living animal shall be food for you. When at the very same time, or, you know, what was it, the year prior when Noah was putting all the animals on the ark, he put, 7 pairs of the clean and 2 pairs of the unclean. So obviously he knew about that. And why 7 versus 2? It's because he had that for sustenance, right? And beyond. So what it actually says in Genesis 9:3 is not every living animal shall be food for you. It says the entire yokeable, tameable animal shall be food for you. Makes a big difference. And that's exactly what all the, third world groups for centuries were doing. They were basically, when they did eat an animal, they ate the entire thing. They ate the guts, all the organs, they ate the bones, boiled them down, cartilage, they used the entire animal.
They still do that in second and third world countries. They use every bit of it, including the head. Goat-headed soup.
That's right, the eyes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, Sunday, last time I saw my mother was on Sunday, and I might have mentioned this Saturday, I don't know if I did or not, but afterwards they had their first pitch-in dinner since COVID. And I went in there because that's where my mother and John was, and we meet each other on Sundays and we talk about what's going on in the place. But everything, I surveyed what food they had. It was at least 75% of the meat, at least, were different pieces of the pig. And the aroma in the room, like for me anyway, certainly not for the pig eaters, but the aroma was like a heavy demonic burden. I couldn't wait to get out of there for that reason, because I don't know, maybe that's what demonic food smells like. I understand if you put a human in the pot, like in Mandingo, that it's going to smell just like a pig.
Wow. Is that right?
Yeah, well, that's no big deal. I'm just saying that it was always that way, going into pitch-in dinners and smelling that. I think of what the Father says regarding these things as being an abomination to you, an abomination to you.
Mm-hmm.
I got my mother off of it a long time ago.
Oh, okay, very good. It's probably why she is healthy as she was. So let's see. I guess so. Yeah. So Steve's going to be asking the questions. And how are we going to split the screen, or how are we going to do that, Jackson?
You can do that. Sure. You want the questions on the screen?
Oh, no. I was just thinking if you wanted to have Steve on one side and I could be on the other side. I didn't know if you could do that. Otherwise, I didn't know how you wanted to set it up.
Might be able to do that. Let's see here. Where is that Steve? Steve, you got to put your picture up there. I know you hate that.
Yeah, I don't even know how to get my picture on there. I can go video, but I might break your lenses.
That's the best I can do right now, is put the whole group up here.
Okay.
And let's see what the view says. Speaker view, gallery view, that's all I have.
Okay. Well, I guess we could flip back and forth from Steve to me. I don't know. I don't know if you can do that, but
yeah, it'll do that automatically whenever he talks.
Oh, okay. Well, then that would be fine.
All
okay.
Right. Then that's speaker view.
Okay. So, Steve, do you want? That's okay. I have a special lens, so I don't think my computer is going to break. So you can go ahead and put your picture up there.
All right.
There he is.
There he is. He's not ugly. I mean, he's no uglier than I am.
I didn't say you's ugly.
Steve, you look great.
All right. All right, man. Very good.
All right. Well, thank you. And I'd like to say hello and welcome all to a very important health talk on some updated info on the COVID-19 issue. Presented by the Vero Essene Yahad. I'm your host, Steve McGuire, and I would like to introduce you to a close friend of the Yahad who has been in the ranks of Essene understanding for many years and a feast keeper now for nearly 20 years. He has had an Adventist background for 20 years prior and has been an RN, a chiropractor for nearly 30, and involved in nutritional arts for nearly the same amount of time, having specialized in nutritional response testing since 2007. It has been his desire since the early 1980s to help people with their challenges, to present our bodies as a living temple of God. Please welcome the Detox Whisperer, Dr. Mark Heston.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve. Very good. Yes, so this is essentially going to be an update from the last talk that we had 2 or 3 months back. But I do want to, because of the fact, getting a little more cutting edge and going to be looking at some more paradigm shift elements, a little bit more of a deeper dive this time. So I just wanted to recite a little disclaimer I have that all the information in this presentation, and that would include answers to questions as well, is not to be construed as any kind of medical advice or medical counsel, but is merely for educational purposes to encourage further study, whether individually or corporately. And just a brief statement on references. I chose not to put the resource links specifically in this recording, but for those that are interested in order to do further study on your own, we're going to make those resources available via the Yahad. You can either contact me through the Yahad, might be one way of doing it, or just to the Yahad, and I will get versed on that. And so then I can forward any kind of web addresses and resources. Yeah, and so I want you to understand that the ideas and concepts presented are not necessarily the beliefs or practices promoted by the Yahad either, okay? And not to bring any unwanted attention to specific medical sources, utilize names of current doctors or a specialist whose work is presented here will remain confidential in our discussion with their works listed in the resource links, but do know that these professionals were considered accomplished and reputable in their fields of study prior to this pandemic. We will discuss mechanisms biologically, politically involved in the pandemic, and some of the whys and historical patterns. And then we'll go ahead and address some of the health concerns that we're presently looking at today and in the near future here. And then just one last little warning here for those who are willing to swallow the red pill, because that's basically what we're doing here. The following material is not based upon the conventional narrative. Neither are the conclusions presented the opinions of the medical majority, and in some cases are even opposed to the counter narrative as well. So if there is anything that you deem to be false or does not make sense, please maintain your attention, hoping that these things, dots are going to be connected and things might be answered as we go along. And if there is no, if it's not satisfying in putting things together for you, obviously you can put a question in the chat, or you could even submit a question to the Yahad, and I can take care of that at another time. So I want to thank you guys for being with us at this late hour. And go ahead, Steve. I'll let you go ahead and ask the questions.
Yes, Dr. Heston, with all the confusion regarding the science of COVID-19, can you set us straight on what is really happening?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Yeah, because there's a lot of confusion out there. And essentially, I'll just give you a brief rundown. And I will emphasize the fact that what I'm about to share with you is not conventional understanding. So this may be a little, again, a paradigm shift thing here. So, we have to understand that the human body, the DNA, which is the blueprint understanding of our bodies, is very, very small. In fact, what's interesting to me is that we have 10 times more bacteria in our body than we do cells. And the bacteria has 10 times more DNA than a human cell on average. So if you do the math in your head, you can figure out that the human DNA potential is 99% bacteria and 1% human. So if we think about the fact, and if it's true what I'm saying, that bacteria outnumber the human cells by 10 times, most of those bacteria are found in the gut, in our lungs, and on our skin. But we also have those bacteria in every major organ of our body, including our brain, but a very minute amount in those other organs. And those bacteria have a job to do, just like everything else that God has designed in this incredible human frame, right? We're made in the image of Yahweh. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. And so in this present environment, we have certain kinds of bacteria in every single organ of the body, just enough to take care of any kind of pathologicals that might enter in. Now, some of these bacteria that are in these organs have the capacity to gobble up about 50 times their body weight in about 24 hours. And so it's amazing, you consider the barrage of bacteria that we're constantly in our environment and based upon the food that we eat, we're subject to a lot of bacteria. And I'll include, you know, fungus, yeast, even viruses, parasites, all these things. We're exposed to a lot of these things. And yes, we have barriers, but yet at the same time, the body knows how to use the good bacteria and incorporate the good bacteria where it needs to be put, okay? So I will mention as an example, there's a particular disease that most everybody's heard of, Parkinson's disease. I'm going to use this as an example for when a bacteria gets the better part of an organ in the body. And we know that Parkinson's disease is basically a reduction in the function of the substantia nigra, which is in the brainstem. Basically, it's not able to make the dopamine anymore like it used to. And so consequently, the ability to control a static muscle position is not really there, right? You get the shakes. Well, basically, the majority of Parkinson's disease is bacterial infestation of the substantia nigra. If you happen to have an opportunity to culture the substantia nigra for somebody that has progressed Parkinson's disease, you would find all sorts of bacteria. And basically, the question might be, well, how in the world can bacteria to that extent get into the substantia nigra? Well, it just so happens to be that the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve, which happens to be everywhere in the body, goes to every single organ in the body. It comes from the word vagrant, right? Wanderer, because that particular nerve connects to every organ, and it has an incredible amount of innervation into the gut. And so the vagus nerve is not only one direction from the brain to the gut and all the other organs, it's basically a bidirectional nerve. Some of the nerves are what they call afferent or efferent. They take messages to, they take messages from. But the vagus nerve is bidirectional. And so over the course of decades of a bad diet, maybe some exposure to certain pesticides, the most common chemical that causes Parkinson's is paraquat, which is an herbicide. But generally, most of your Parkinson's are bad, you know, decades and decades of refined carbohydrates, lack of saturated fat, reduction in cholesterol. I mean, basically, oh, and multiple uses of antibiotics over the course of those years, and many of them have been on 2 or 3 chronic doses of a couple of medications that have a lot of side effects that are similar to Parkinson's disease, oddly enough, that were very common back in the 80s and the 90s. So people that have partaken of those, for those that are interested, I could resource that for you. I've forgotten some of that information, but basically that's what it comes down to. And so, but you can get some benefit from doing a proper diet. But anyway, it's sort of a long way of explaining that there's at least one organ of the body, right? That explaining how you can get bacterial involvement. But of course, our main concern here is talking about viruses today. So I want to follow up this bacteria concept with another concept. And I don't know if I shared this before or not, but there's a thing called pleomorphism that is commonly known amongst microbiologists. And that is that a bacteria can turn into a fungus can turn into a virus, typically not into a parasite, but basically a bacteria can revert to either virus or fungus, depending on the environment and the pH in which it's in. This is part of the reason why viral involvement can happen. If there's a drastic reduction in oxygen in an organ, that organ is going to, the bacteria in that organ are going to revert to viruses to do major cleanup. When the oxygen tension returns, The viruses tend to reduce in number, okay? So basically a virus is a low oxygen tension infestation. It can't really get a handle on someone who has a reasonable health unless their oxygen tension is low. So now the first thing you're going to think of is what? Is this mask mandate, right? We all know that people that wear the masks, especially if you have it over the nose and the mouth, and those people that have to wear it through the course of their occupation, we've heard various different stories about what happened to them. People get all these rashes, then they get on antibiotics, nothing's working, and then they take their mask off, and lo and behold, it disappears. I don't know if you guys have heard some of this kind of stuff. But essentially, the mask is kind of setting us up with the low oxygen tension to allow the virus to have to set up housekeeping. So just it's incredible. Let me just kind of review a couple of things that I've got here. Yeah, so the other thing about viruses, I want you guys to understand that viruses are species specific. I'm going to repeat that. Viruses are species specific. So when they say that a bat was hanging around with a pangolin in the same market with pigs, and things were not necessarily clean like they should be, that over a period of days that this is going to evolve into some strange kind of virus. That's absolutely false. There's no way that can happen. So because a virus is species specific, because what it is, it's basically when the bacteria breaks down in animals, and we're talking about bacteria that are species specific. They have their own microbiome that can break down when their environment is compromised, and viruses will happen. But because of the sequence, the DNA sequence within the virus, and even the RNA viruses, they have sequences such that are specific to the type of animal, to the species. So there's no way that that could happen unless you splice some DNA sequence from, or even an RNA sequence from one animal and splice it into the nucleic acid sequence of another animal. That's the only way you can do it.
Is that a natural occurrence?
No.
Okay.
No. So all the virus infestations that we've gotten prior to the last 100 years has all been human-based species-related viruses. Mumps, measles, smallpox, things like that. Those are all human-based viruses. And so when we get toxic enough, and again, our oxygen tension gets low enough, we could and certainly if we get exposed to somebody else who's in a similar situation, we could take on that particular virus that they're exhaling or is in their saliva or other body fluids. But so that's essentially, so there never really has been any viral plagues in ancient history. They've only been bacterial or parasitic, never viral, because of the species thing. Any other question on that? Or we can go on to the next.
Yeah, isn't it, doctor, isn't it true that the MDs tell us that cold and flu symptoms are caused by a virus?
Yeah, so the doctors are saying this when in actuality, you know, we were designed to be outside most of the time. We were designed to be foragers, to eat raw food from time to time, a preponderance of raw food actually. And so hence we're supposed to have vitamin D and vitamin C. Those are the two things that were missing when we come down with flu symptoms. And this is what any naturopath or anybody who has any understanding of nutrition will tell you, that when it comes to cold and flu season, you want to up your vitamin C and your vitamin D. Those are the two biggies. And of course, zinc is a big one. But that, by and large, that's the main concern. Now I'm going to get into, I'll get into a little bit later, this idea about flu in a little more depth. But.
Well, since the flu is caused by a virus, how can anyone acquire swine flu or bird flu?
Well, now that's a very good question. So you'll notice that bird flu was totally unheard of a few generations ago. Swine flu, several generations ago, never heard of the thing. Okay. And I'm going to get into that a little further. And again, this is because the matching, basically man has been taking viruses of different animals and incubating those in petri dishes and culturing them with human tissue to make vaccines. And now we have the technology, and have for actually the majority of this century that we're in, to slice and splice and put different sequences together. And so this is what we're looking at. So all the, the H1N1, the H5N1, the SARS and the MERS, the Ebola, these are all man-made bioengineered viruses. They never had those several generations ago.
Then why are there so many variations of these viruses?
Yeah, okay, so that's a reasonable question. So, yeah, so because the scientists will tell you, yeah, there's like over 100,000 different kinds of swine viruses. Surely those are going to eventually get into the, the human system somehow and create a problem. Not. Basically, the reason why the swine has so many thousands and thousands of different kinds of varieties of viruses is because they've been exposed to so many different kinds of crap, right? Garbage. And that's what they subsist on. All of us who have been studying scriptural concepts have come to understand that, the swine were outside the camp and they basically took care of the garbage. And so they were exposed to a lot of bad stuff, a lot of bacteria, parasites, you name it. And so when their tissues would break down to the point where viruses, massive tissue breakdown viruses would come in, those are all specifically related just to the swine. Now, when it says not to touch the swine, this is because of the bacteria and the parasites, but it's not the viruses. So, and so when they say that, someone touched anything that was considered unclean, they had to go outside the camp, and they were considered unclean until the evening. You guys remember that? Essentially, the reason why is because they had to be exposed to the sun for the whole day, ultraviolet light and oxygen, not to be in the tent, so that the combination of the oxygen and the UV is going to eliminate the bacteria and viral problem if there was any virus that they got from, say, somebody else. But and that was the reason for the unclean till evening. Let's see, did I cover? Was there any other question on that topic that anybody had maybe? I will say this, that, yeah, so the swine flu, the bird flu, and the reason why we could acquire that from somebody else, it's only because they've had a vaccine, one of the more common or more recent vaccines in the last 20, 30 years. and sharing bodily fluids. And a mother can pass these on to their child through breastfeeding, can pass it on to the child in vaginal delivery. So the only other virus that I'm aware of that where an animal can pass it to a human is rabies. And rabies happens to be one of the oldest known viruses. You could check the research on this. That they've determined rabies to be older than 4,000 years old, which would take us back to the time of Nimrod, when they were playing with interspecies breeding and stuff. And I don't know how they understood how to do some of that kind of stuff, but I think probably some relevance to that. But that's the only thing where an animal virus can be communicated to a human, and it might be related to that. Not really sure about it.
What about forms of viruses such as HIV, H1N1, SARS, and Ebola?
Yeah. So all those, yeah. So all those, and you'll notice that all these are recent ones. Now, back when the H1N1, back in, 2008, 2009, they said that they had exhumed a frozen body up in Alaska of a World War I veteran who had died up there, who had died of the Spanish flu back in the early 1920s or something. We know that was an issue back in 1919 and into the early 1920s. And that caused the pandemic back then. And they were calling that H1N1. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll get into that on another question, because I think we're getting into another point on this, but yeah, let me hold the remainder of that, but I will tell you that, well, you'll see the answer on this one in a little bit, but let me see what, I should probably mention, yeah, so let's go back, and I know you guys, you got anybody here on the Yahad, on our present, or anybody who visits the Yahad, who might even see this recording wherever we're going to put this. I forgot what I was going to say now. Yeah, you guys have been, learning and probably going to alternative sites, learning about what's going on with alternative concepts relevant to this COVID thing. And I just find it very interesting that, there was no bats in the market, when it turns out. There was no bats for 600 miles from the market because all the bats were in hibernation at the time. It's kind of incredible that they, are trying to get away with this kind of stuff. But but let's back up a little bit. Yeah, so I'll give you kind of a preliminary information regarding H1N1. If we go back to the era of Vietnam War, in the latter end of the Vietnam War in the early 1970s, there was, and some of us who are old enough might recall some of this, is that there was millions of dollars earmarked for biological research that came under the Department of Defense, looking for biological warfare to defend our forces. What better way to attack your enemy than with an army of bacteria or parasites? Kind of makes a lot of sense, huh? And so in the early 70s, there was a lot of research by our nation into biological warfare during the time of the Vietnam War. And it was around the same time that Richard Nixon had declared war on cancer also. And so money was earmarked for that. It's kind of interesting that both were going on at the same time. Well, I find it very interesting that even after the Vietnam War, and to our knowledge, they did not use anything like that, other than using things like Agent Orange and destroying our own men. But as far as bacterial or any kind of parasite thing that they were trying to do, that we don't know anything about that. But what's interesting, there was a swine flu that developed about a year after the war ended. You guys remember that? 1976, there was concern about a swine flu. Now remember, if it's true what I'm saying, that swine virus cannot be relayed to a human unless it's spliced in the sequence somehow. So during the course of this biological warfare research that was going on in the early 70s, all of a sudden we have this swine flu come out shortly after the Vietnam War. And so there was a, large-scale government-sponsored vaccine stations across the country, hospitals, even in schools. I had gotten the shot at my high school, and lo and behold, there was a handful. It was a very small number. I think it was less than 10 people that had died from that, and so they pulled it. There was a public outcry, and so they pulled it. And so, the pressure was on the FDA to have the vaccine companies destroy that virus and the vaccine, and which they said they did, but they did not. They actually vaulted it. They put it in storage. Okay. Let me come back here to my notes here. And
how do we know?
Yeah, well, just one other thing on that, though, Steve. So what's interesting is after that, it was after that, everybody gets these swine flu and vaccines. Then all of a sudden we had this outbreak called herpes simplex. You guys remember that? Epstein-Barr virus. Where did that come from? That was all part of this vaccine initiative. And that became an issue in the late 70s into the early 80s and beyond. And that was all because of this biological warfare study and research. Yeah, any other questions on that?
It's just, how do we know all this is true?
Well, and so that's where I'm going to provide some of those resources to you guys to study this, and to make, and again, these things have to be congruent with Scripture. They have to make sense. I will say that there was a guy you guys remember the HIV outbreak was in the early 80s also, right? And I don't know if you guys were aware, but Fauci was involved in that one as well. Well, nearly a decade later, there was an eminent, highly respected medical doctor who had multiple degrees, one of which in research. And so he wound up doing his own individual research. It's the independent labs that usually come up with interesting information. Of course, a lot of that stuff is squashed and never gets to the general public. I missed that question. Somebody put a question in the chat. What was that? Does somebody want to unmute your mic and ask, what was the question on that HIV? Okay, so what this doctor who had done the research, and he validated, I remember going through his research back in the early 90s, 94 is when I took his stuff and evaluated this. And he had found that the HIV sequence was absolutely identical to a combination of a sheep Visna virus combined to a cow leukemia virus. And in his attempt to expose this information, obviously you guys know that's going to get squashed. And but he went through the proper channels and going to the CDC and FDA and whatnot, and of course that's where it stopped, right? And then he wound up being on the run. But basically, and so what happened was this particular virus, this was actually introduced into the Hep vaccines, the very new and early Hep vaccines in the early 1980s that were introduced to those who were more inclined or at risk to get hepatitis B. And those were drug abusers who typically, many of those have an alternative lifestyle as well. And this was introduced into the vaccines, the Hep B vaccines in the early 80s, predominantly in cities like New York, Houston, LA, San Francisco. So that was well known amongst those who have been doing the research regarding this fellow who exposed that. And again, I'm going to give you guys some resources to validate some of this kind of stuff for those that want to study this further. Any other questions on that? Right. Okay. Yeah. So I guess I answered that question. Yeah. So Steve.
Yes. The next question I have on here is, does the seasonal flu vaccine that they've offered for years give any protection from the coronavirus?
And that would be a reasonable question to ask. I will say that unfortunately, the flu vaccine that many people have been getting annually for many years, and it's those people that, and usually people will get the flu vaccine a few times, and maybe they'll notice that, gee, right after I got that flu vaccine, I came down with the flu. Took me a couple of weeks to get through it. I don't know if you guys have had friends that have made any comments about that, but that's kind of, well, of course, I deal with a lot of people that go to the medical doctor, go to the pharmacy, and they'll get that flu vaccine. And of course, a lot of them that come to see me, have had issues with the flu vaccine in the past. It's part of the reason why they're coming to see me. And let's see. So basically, the flu vaccine in the more recent past has had some pretty heavy chemicals in it. Some of you guys are aware. There's mercury, and it's methyl mercury is what it is, which is 50 times more toxic than elemental mercury. And the intent of that was to reduce or attenuate the virus that they put into the vaccine, but at the same time, they're intoxicating the human body as they're trying to depress the immune system to create, or stimulate it, is what they're saying, to create an antibody response. You get enough of those flu vaccines, and it's just, you get burdened and you don't have that response. So basically, it's just setting you up for more problems. But so I don't recommend any flu vaccine. And so long as vaccines have any kind of toxic substances in it and any kind of live or attenuated microorganisms, I would say not to partake of it. Yahweh's intent to strengthen our immune system is through natural processes, what they call natural immunity. Natural immunity is so much more stronger and effective than artificial immunity, which is what they call the cascade that they use by vaccines, or even the sugar pill or whatever they might use. But when you're actually exposed to the disease and you're relatively healthy, your immune system is going to give you a lifelong immunity to whether it's a bacteria or a virus, whatever it might be. That's your best mode of defense, is the system that Yahweh has pre-designed within your system. Now, I want to give you guys a little history on viruses. Viral pandemics have only been an issue in the last 100 years. Why is that? Well, I'm going to pose a mechanism for you. And many people will debunk this, but this is what I believe is actually going on. So the Spanish flu, we know there was vaccines involved with that. But the Spanish flu, we know the soldiers received vaccines when they were over in Spain. That's why they call it Spanish flu. They're also inundated with a lot of sugar. They actually kept the sugar away from the general public so they could ship the sugar to the soldiers who are on the front lines in Europe so they would have energy to fight. So they combined sugar with these vaccines, right? Well, the actual flu symptoms that they actually got was after the war. And this was in 1919 that this actually started happening. And so what happened at about that time also was in 1918, at the end of the war, there were radio stations in virtually every major city in every major Western nation across the globe. And so the radio waves were, the human frame of all living forms were basically being exposed to radio waves for the first time on a global scale in 1918 and 1919. Now it takes about 6 to 8 months generally for the bacteria, our microbiome, which is the preponderance of the bacteria, right, which is mostly the DNA of our human frame, is related to our microbiome. And I will say that the microbiome of the human species back then was so much more broad, had a much greater different types of species of health promoting bacteria, many of which are probably extinct to this day. But we had hundreds and hundreds of transient and permanent health promoting bacteria back then when people were canning their own food, eating unrefined food, had less access to processed food and less access to canned food. And grandma and mom were making food off the farm and all this. And so the general individual, it was only the people in the cities that tended to be more sick than the people out in the country back then. But the microbiome got a hit when radio waves were introduced on a global scale. And that hit basically created flu symptoms. And the sicker and the weaker the individual, the older the person as well, those are the ones that were more inclined to coming down with problems. Now, I know that sounds kind of incredible, but follow the pattern here. So the next flu epidemic that happened was shortly after World War II, which happened to be at a time when radar, now radar was being used toward the end of World War II on limited scale. But after the war, all the Allied bases, both naval and Air Force, across the globe started using radar. And so radar was exposed to a lot of these, mostly coastal cities and a bit more large cities being exposed to radar. And so we have another frequency spectrum that, again, our microbiome is exposed to, and it causes the bacteria to fractionate, creates a viral cascade to a small degree, which then in turn will give you flu symptoms, right? Which is the body's cleansing of those bacteria that are broken down, okay? The next viral pandemic was in the, let's see, well, actually, yeah, it was in 1957, 58 was the Asian flu, And that's when China turned on their radar for the first time in the southern quadrant of the nation there. And so that's where the Asian flu. Now, the thing about polio, now that's another virus, not a flu category per se, but I'm just going to give you a little nickel knowledge on the polio thing. Now, the polio virus is not a communicable virus. And so why are we giving a vaccine for that? Now, we've been told that this is related to, lack of sanitation, been exposed to somebody else, but technically it's not really a communicable virus when you study it out. So it's not a flu thing. Well, how is it that it was almost pandemic in the fact that we had people coming down with neurological symptoms, they had paraplegia, some to the extent where it affected their breathing, they had to be put in an iron lung. We probably read about that in school if you hadn't had relatives that had talked about it or even been exposed or had conditions relevant to it. But basically polio, if we recognize that a human virus, is God's way of cleansing the system, okay? When a bacteria breaks down to a viral component, the virus intent is to replicate in the cell, to make a lot, to kill that cell, to go on to the next cell, to kill that cell, basically to kill the cells in that vicinity because of a toxin, in this case with polio, okay? So what was that toxin? Well, it turned out that the reason why we had this problem in the early 1950s is because by then canned food was commonplace. Almost every American table had canned food every day of every week. And the cans back then were not lined with thin layers of plastic like they are today. And so the food invariably would get a high dose of tin. And so when you cook that, you're taking hot food and you're canning that, right? You're getting a lot of tin in that food. So tin is actually a neurotoxin. And you couple that with DDT. Now remember, DDT was sprayed everywhere. It was considered to be totally immune to the human body. In fact, some doctors were even saying that it was good for you. I don't know where that concept came from or what they were thinking, but basically the DDT, which is a type of chloromethane, turns out is also neurotoxic. So if you combine the neurotoxicity of tin with DDT, those neurotoxins affect the Schwann cells of the nerves. That's the very intimate fat cell that is connected to the nerve lining. And so when that fat when that particular toxin gets into the fat, preponderance for fat, it affects that particular nerve. Now, most of the nerves that have Schwann cell linings are the large nerve bundles, like the ones that go to the legs. This is why people were getting lower extremity paraplegia from polios, because their exposure to tin toxicity and exposure to DDT. I don't know if you guys ever seen some of the newsreels, back in the 1950s. They used to spray the parks and the people, municipal parks and waterfronts, pool areas and all this kind of stuff. They would spray the kids and the adults and with a DDT. And we wonder why we had a pandemic. Well, they didn't really eliminate DDT. We know we've almost had several animals go extinct because of the DDT. Well, the FDA finally put a clamp on DDT in 1972. I'm not sure exactly when it was that they started doing the plastic lining on the tin cans, but it was probably somewhere around that time or late into the 60s somewhere. Anyway, there was plastic lining in the tin cans by the 1970s. And so by the latter portion of the 1970s, there was no more polio. And they attributed it to the vaccine. Now, they introduced the polio vaccine just as when this thing was dipping down. In other words, when they realized that the DDT and the tin were a contributor, that's when they introduced the polio vaccine. So when the various manufacturers had to comply and had to have, you know, plastic linings or do some alternative type of canning, whatever what might be, they had to reduce some of this tin involvement, and they reduced the use of DDT to just crop fields, I believe, at this time, and so this downward curve of polio. At the time that the Sabin and the Salk vaccines were introduced in the mid-50s, is naturally attributed to that. Well, that was not what it was. In fact, Salk himself, in the latter 70s, they had a special medical congress of sorts. They excuse me, had a special dinner for Salk to celebrate the eradication of polio. And Salk himself said that it wasn't the vaccine that eliminated polio. Total silence in that massive auditorium filled with PhDs and researchers and doctors. But it never went to press. That statement of his never got some light. Now, he attributed to septic and sewer systems and the improved sanitation issue, but it was actually the elimination of the tin and the DDT. So going back to this flu model, I'm sorry, to continue this pattern about the flu being an introduction of various different ranges of frequencies that the general public's being exposed to. Consider that, so I brought you up to the radar issue, right? That was in all the major cities back in the early 50s with the Asian flu and all that. But in 1968, we had the Hong Kong flu that hit a lot of the major cities in some of the major Western countries. Well, lo and behold, every Western nation had put up a satellite for satellite communication for its own country and some of the neighboring countries. And so those citizens were bombarded with satellite frequencies in the year before. So, add 6 to 8 months and what's going to happen, right? So the bacteria get a constant barrage of these new frequencies. It's going to cause a breakdown of the bacteria, some to the extent of viruses, which again gives you the flu symptoms, and it's the body's way of eliminating those or getting rid of dead tissue, dead bacteria that have come in the form of virus at this point, okay? And again, that was because of new frequencies exposed from satellite. Now, the next flu issues that came along to any epidemic level was in 2002, 2003. You guys probably remember that. That's the SARS and the MERS, right? It happened at about that time. And, well, guess what? 3G was introduced just months prior to the SARS outbreak and the MERS outbreak, just months before. 3G, whole new range of frequencies. The next concern of an epidemic, what they called the swine flu, that you guys remember, 2009, 2010. 2009 is when they turned on 4G. Again, a new level of frequency ranges. And so now here we are coming into 5G, and they're telling us this COVID thing is everywhere. This is what's actually happening. So all the stuff that happened in Wuhan was not the virus as much as the doctors would tell you, because that's what they had been conditioned to be trained in. They understood that these kind of symptoms that they were seeing were relevant to a viral outbreak. Well, that was not actually the case. The virus is essentially reserved for the mRNA in the vaccines that were due to come, right? So this was not an accidental thing in Wuhan. I don't believe that. This was orchestrated, it had been planned. You know, you guys know, those that have been studying some of this stuff, that Fauci had mentioned back in 2017 that during President Trump's tenure that there's going to be a viral outbreak. Some of you guys have seen that. Sure enough, that's what happened. So, so all the symptoms that they were seeing in Wuhan hospital, the doctors were trained to think these were virus when in actuality it was a flu-like symptoms caused by the 5G. Now the 5G happens to be a whole new echelon of frequencies. This is near microwave, okay? And so what the 5G is actually doing, that frequency is so high, is that it's exciting the external electrons on the oxygen molecule. Some of you guys are aware of this. And those electrons spin so fast that when you breathe the oxygen into your lungs, the RBCs have a very difficult time picking up that oxygen because of that spinning, high fast spinning electrons. Now, if you have an adequate amount of zinc in your RBC, you're going to have a greater likelihood of latching onto that oxygen, even though it's got those high spinning electrons going on. So this is essentially what was happening. So they've been playing with 4.5G and 5G in the various cities. So when you got outbreaks, even in the hospitals, so the hospitals had 5G. The hospitals that had the ventilators also had 5G, okay? So all these weird and unusual deaths that created the outcry and the fear mongering by the MSM was basically 5G. So the COVID has been introduced by the vaccines, okay? So I find it interesting, before the vaccines were even introduced, we had the sequence of the COVID virus. Where did that come from? Yet nobody was able to isolate the thing, and yet we had the sequence. What's that about? And supposedly that sequence had H1N1, H5N1, had SARS and MERS, had Ebola in it, even had a rabies sequence in it. What is all that? I think it's just pure fear-mongering. It's probably BS. But I will say that they have put together quite a package. They've been studying this stuff, you know, just like with any kind of technology, it can be used for the good and it can be used for the bad. And so right now it's in the hand, this technology of gene splicing has been in the hands of the bad with what's going on politically and all that. So let's see where we're at. And so, you know, I recognize this is a paradigm shift, but this is what I believe is really going on. And so for those that really want to get a better handle on this, like I said, I'm going to have some resources available through the Yahad so you can kind of study that. If you have specific questions, even beyond our time here today, you can send them via the Yahad to me, to my attention, and I'll address those. You know, I'll mention that, you know, back in the days, I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Raymond Rife, back in the 1930s, who was utilizing frequencies to kill pathological bacteria.
You bet.
And yeah. And so back in the 1930s, he was aware of this. He had an incredibly powerful microscope that he engineered and built himself. Incredible thing. Nobody's been able to repeat the work that guy's done with the, I mean, if you guys ever see a picture of his microscope, I mean, it looks like something out of some sci-fi planet from somewhere. It's just so many knobs, buttons, and little switches on that thing. It's just incredible. But he, this is, you know, pre-electron microscope days. And this guy was able to see viruses, and he saw them as exosomes. They were called exosomes because an exosome looks identical to a virus. Basically, it's an encapsulated nucleic acid within the body that's there for a purpose, whatever that was, to break down the tissue, whether it was because of the toxins or because of a deficiency. That's the only reason why a deficiency, any kind of tissue would break down, is because of a toxin or a deficiency, and the body would make these exosomes. If the oxygen tension got low enough, the exosomes would come in and do some major cleansing. And predominantly, usually, the older cells, the weaker cells, that's pretty much the ones that go first. So Raymond Rife knew about this, and he knew frequencies that would kill good bacteria. He knew frequencies that could kill bad bacteria. And his emphasis, and his was all, he was working with all these different frequencies, and he would find the morph, was mortality, oscillation, resonant frequency, morph frequency, of various different microorganisms, and he would catalog all this stuff. And so that guy was an incredible genius, and of course he was shut down. You guys probably know, if you guys know anything about Raymond Rife, you know about that. In fact, we have probably the most cutting edge Rife-based frequency machine on the market. Best one for the money. There's a guy who's done all sorts of research on Rife machines. He had built and designed his own, and he says this particular one, the BCX, one that I actually sell. In fact, the guy who developed was my patient. That's how I got in on it. The BCX Rife machine is the best bang for the money. But we can actually promote good bacteria with good frequencies, which are low-level frequencies, and we can kill the bad bacteria. Well, we can kill the bad bacteria with lower frequencies. We can promote bad bacteria with much higher frequencies, of which this machine does not do, obviously. But anyhow, let me see what I just want to make sure I got into everything.
My wife went to a Rifean physician several times with her cancer. It was a very, very unusual appointment. I put a link on here to one of Rife's microscopes. Might want to look at that if you never heard of this guy. But they have to hide out now. They're still hunting down.
Right. And so one of the things that needs to be addressed along with the Rife thing is taking care of deficiencies. You got to have those deficiencies addressed, especially if you're going to deal with cancer. Otherwise, this stuff is very likely going to come back, or it can. So just a little side note, I just thought I'd share this. FDR, you guys know that he came down with polio back in the 1920s. I think it was let's see, I have my notes here, 1921, at the age of 39, he came down with polio. And basically what it was is, back then, canned food was only for the more affluent of society. And so he was partaking of a lot of canned food. And he came down with it when he was in a waterfront. I think he was vacationing up in the state of Maine, where they had used basically the first generation of a chloromethane pesticide. It was an early type of DDT. So he was exposed to that. And so that's basically how he came down with polio.
Canned food. Consider that. And it finally got him, what, in 45?
Well, he actually died of a stroke, a massive stroke, they said. Yeah.
He was so weak, though, there was nothing left of him.
Yeah.
Do you want to continue this in another session?
Yeah, because we've probably gone over time, so that's fine. Sure.
Yeah, a little bit. All right, let's do that. I mean, this is great. I learned so much, especially when you talked about the shall we say, evolution of bacteria to virus to fungi. And there was another thing.
Just one other little note on that called pleomorphism. Let's see. He was a contemporary of Louis Pasteur and was in total opposition of the germ theory that Louis Pasteur had. Antoine Béchamp, that was his name. He was a European as well. And he was the one that talked about how a bacteria can revert to a fungus and a fungus back to a bacteria to a virus based upon the environment and the molecular components that are available to that organism in that environment. And it was basically on Louis Pasteur's deathbed that he finally admitted that Béchamp was right. But yet we're taught this germ theory, you know, since we're in grammar school and all this stuff, and it's just totally wrong. And so a lot of us are germ phobic, and it was not the case. And we could talk a little bit more of that at another time. But
I think when you said that the amount of bacteria in your system as compared to the number of cells in your system, I think that would knock some mask wearers off their rocker.
Right.
Yeah. Well, maybe next time too, if you wouldn't mind, maybe you could go into the prion a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. That's where we were going to go to next. But that's fine. Okay. We can talk about that. Sure. No, we can schedule that.
Can we do that like next week? Would you be open to that?
Let's see. I think I could do. Let's see, next Sunday. Yeah, tentatively, I think so. I'll look at my schedule. At present, I think that'll work. So 5 o'clock next Sunday. Yeah.
This was great. This is
or 5 o'clock my time. Yeah. Right.
Steve, you have anything else to say?
I just want to thank Dr. Heston for bringing this word to us and presenting it for us to have the truth.
Right. Well, thank you, Steve. Yeah. And I'll touch on some scriptural elements and tie some of this together for us next week then.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
See you on the Shabbat.
Okay. Good night.